Now, 2024, one-third of Africa will go to the polls with key issues on the ballot in at least 18 of the continent's countries. Now, these countries include Cotonou, Mali, Chad, and Burkina Faso, if their respective junta leaders keep their word. Analysts say that many African countries are traveling down a dangerous path for democracy that has long been considered a beacon of stability in Africa. With South Africa celebrating 30 years of democracy. But the biggest question for 2024 seems to be whether the ruling African National Congress can cling to its now fragile grip on power. Meanwhile, countries like Rwanda, Chad, Ghana, and Tunisia also have their own share of economic, political, and social challenges. But the biggest challenge they face is democracy that appears to be in crisis in most African countries. To discuss this further, we are joined by two gentlemen. That's Professor Seepe, a political analyst. He joins from Pretoria, South Africa. And also Dr. Omolulu, that's Fagbadedo, also a political analyst. He joins from Ondo State, Nigeria. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you for inviting us.
All right, I'd like to start off with you, Professor Seepe. Now, what are the key factors that you believe can shape the upcoming 2024 elections in the African states?
I think, first of all, we need to understand that democracy works according to the terms of engagement. And what has marred the democratic experiment in the rest of Africa has always been whether the playing field has been leveled. You need to have parties that are free to campaign, and you also need to have the free press. And most importantly, you need to have an active citizenship. If the people are not going to participate in the voting process, then the experiment, democratic experiment, becomes simply a sham. So those are the fundamentals, that there must be terms of engagement. Secondly, what we need also is a sense of stability. You cannot have democracy in the context of conflict. So the idea of the African Union putting emphasis on the silencing of the gun is something that is very important. But also, we must also understand that people participate in the democracy because there's something in it for them. If people find that the democratic process does not yield dividends, and when you talk about dividends here, we're talking about where the material conditions are improved, then they will lose faith in the democratic experiment. So this is also what has marred the continent, because what the loss of faith in democracy comes because people feel that the democratic dividend has not been realized by the majority of Africa's citizens.
All right, now my next question is to Dr. Fagbadedo. Do you think the elections contributed to democratic development in Africa, and what are the major challenges and issues that the African countries face to achieve democracy?
Thank you so much. Election itself, the essence is to allow people to elect, to choose their leaders by themselves, not through the barrier of the guns. Yes, so in some areas, African countries have been able to exercise this power in terms of electing people. But to say whether this has contributed to development, it is sad to note that though we have democratically elected leaders, but we have leaders who have failed to manage the resources in a manner that will provide democratic development. Democratic development in terms of people's welfare, promotion of people's welfare, in terms of good governance, in terms of inclusive development in society. We cannot have this in a situation whereby we have leaders who are corrupt and have mismanaged public resources. So that that is why in recent times you see African countries going back into the era of the military, and the military intervention have been justified by the spate of instability and poverty that has pervaded most of these African countries. So we can say that, well, election has come and it has given us the opportunity to elect our leaders, but the leaders that emerge through electoral process have failed Africans. And we find it very difficult to even understand or have what we call the benefits of our electoral activity. In terms of dividend of democracy, we cannot see the dividend of democracy compared with other countries that are other democratic countries in the world. And so that has been the problem that we have. And to that extent, it is difficult to say that elections have been bringing about solution and promoting of stability. In fact, instead of promoting stability, electoral process have been leading to instability. And the reason is because our elections are fraudulent most of the time, because leaders want to keep in power. They want to be in power through fraudulent means.
All right. I'd like Professor Seepe to actually react to Dr. Fagbadedo saying that elections have actually not sort of brought about stability, on the African continent politically. What's your take?
Well, the first point that he raises is the elections that are fraudulent. When you do have fraudulent elections, then you're starting on the wrong footing. So that's one thing that this is why in most countries we've had what you call election observers, because what we want to do is to minimize the possibility of fraud. Because once you have fraud, then it means you do not have the will of the people. And if the will of the people is not respected, then this will lead to instability. So sham elections will lead to instability. And sham elections will make development not possible, because those who get into those positions, it is more they are in that position because of the self-interest that they want to pursue. But if you talk about democracy as the will of the people and for the people, and that requires a free expression by the people. But even within that, there's also an issue of corruption. And corruption comes in sometimes when it becomes difficult to remove people who are no longer serving the people. This is why regular elections are very important, because it is about the governors accounting to the governed. So, and if you perform badly, the people will then choose a different government. But what we've seen in Africa is leaders who tend to overstay their welcome. But there are times when people, when they see material conditions changing, that they will continue to elect the same people over and over again. And we should not have a problem with that for as long as those elections are seen to be free and fair.
Okay, I just want to comment there. You said the people sometimes keep electing the same people over and over again. Are you of the school of thought that every tenure should have a limit?
Well, yeah, I mean, we should actually be very clear about that, because when people are given, like in our country, we have 2 terms for a president. And I think it is a correct thing that 10 years is long enough for you to come up with the best ideas you can. But also we should shy away from or move away from the assumption that we have people who are God's gift to mankind. And if people are that good, it is their responsibility to make sure that they do the work on making sure that there's a succession plan where others will take over. But once people get into thinking that they're the best thing that ever happened to their country, then you should know that you have actually a problem. Yes, the issue of term is not about impugning the integrity of individuals, but to simply say you've been provided with an opportunity, and let other people come in who can come up with fresh ideas. And we've seen that in some countries, actually, most often, people who overstay their welcome do not bring about development in our own country.
All right. Now, Professor Seepe, I would stay on you because my next question has to do with South Africa. Now, let's talk about the upcoming elections that, of course, will happen right there. What are the dynamics at play? We have seen former President Jacob Zuma forming another party. Where does this leave the ANC in all of this?
Well, the ANC has been in government or leading government for the last 30 years. And in those 30 years, it has had pluses and misses. And there is, as you would expect, people do get tired of the same people, especially when that party is not delivering. And throughout the years, we've seen the ANC losing. Actually, or put differently, we have seen a number of splits with people who are not happy with the ruling party. And part of it is that the ruling party has also failed to reinvent itself. It still uses the language of liberation. But when you're in government, there's the issue of accountability. But also, there's been a challenge of transformation where, despite the electoral strength, that electoral strength is not translated to where the conditions of people on the ground improves. This is why the first offshoot was the economic freedom fighters, who had actually put the issue of economic transformation as very central.
All right.
And this is where also Zuma comes in.
I'm sorry, I just need to interrupt because we're pressed for time. I would also just quickly, in 30 seconds, if I can just know the opinion of Dr. Fagbadedo on the key steps African countries can actually take to achieve stability and strengthen democratic governance.
The most important thing is that there must be integrity of electoral outcomes. When there is integrity and there's no sign of manipulation, it is then we can talk about credibility. Credible electoral process will lead to the production of credible leaders. Credible leaders will be able to lead in terms by developing society, not through corruption. When you see leaders that want to stay on in power for a long time, it means that they are selfish and they have turned the system into a personalized political system. The most important, let's have credible election. Credible election will lead to credible leaders. Thank you.
All right, gentlemen, thank you so much for your time.
You're welcome.
All right.